Hello everyone, I think we can start now. So my name is Anaïs and I am the founding Community of Practice Analyst. So welcome to our webinar, which is a live talk number 7, dedicated to how CDRFI policies and programs can address gender-based violence. So this live talk is organized and promoted by FAMD and the InsuResilience Global Partnership within the framework of their engagement together with the Platform for Agricultural Risk Management and the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD. So this event is also proposed to you on the occasion of the upcoming International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and the 16 Days of Activism against Gender-Based Violence. So just before starting, I just wanted to let you know that this session will be recorded and available on replay and shared on our website and social media. So during the webinar, you are more than welcome to ask questions, of course, using the chat box that you have on the bottom of your screen, and then the speakers will direct your question during the dedicated time. And eventually, at the end of this webinar, you will also see an automatic survey that will appear on your screen. So it is just for you to give us some feedback that are always useful. And also now I will share with you a bit later the link to our FAMD Community of Practice, which is an interactive space for exchanges and to receive peer-to-peer support on agricultural risk management. So, of course, we highly encourage you to join us there. But now, without further ado, I will leave the floor to Ines for her welcoming remarks. So over to you, Ines.
Thank you, Anaïs. And hello, everyone. My name is Ines Perez, and on behalf of the InsuResilience Centre of Excellence on Gender Smart Solutions, I would like to welcome you guests and speakers to today's Live Talk 7. The InsuResilience Centre of Excellence on Gender Smart Solutions is a knowledge-sharing platform that is hosted by the InsuResilience Global Partnership and co-financed by the German BMZ and Global Affairs Canada. The platform contains knowledge products by a great community of gender champions, policymakers, and practitioners from the COE's Gender Working Group. Among the many resources that we provide, over the last year, we have been offering technical support on gender and CDRFI related topics through a technical advisor facility, which has the goal of scaling up the application of knowledge on gender smart CDRFI solutions. During this live talk today, we will be sharing insights from organizations that have participated in the InsuResilience Technical Advisory Facility on different topics, all united by the cross-cutting theme of having considered risks and impacts related to gender-based violence in different ways. I will now hand over to our facilitator, Catherine Miles, to continue with the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Ines and Anaïs. So we're gathered here today, as Anaïs mentioned, for today's webinar in advance of the 16 Days of Activism against Gender-Based Violence, which is an international campaign that kicks off on the 25th of November, which is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Now, the UN Secretary-General's campaign, Unite by 2030 to End Violence Against Women, also runs in parallel to the 16 Days of Activism. And it focuses on a specific theme each year. And this year is Unite, Invest to Prevent Violence Against Women and Girls. Now, this is going to be a theme that we'll be touching on today's discussions. So turning to the agenda, we will look today at, first of all, having a participant poll, getting a bit of input from yourselves. And then we're going to have 2 very brief presentations. And then the main proceedings will be then a panel discussion before we close. We're joined by some fantastic speakers, all with a wealth of experience on this topic, and will share their expertise and insights with us. In no particular order, I start with Anina Hartung, who's the Officer for Resilient Development at ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, Faith Wachira, Regional Programme Associate, Agenda and Food Systems from the World Food Programme, WFP, and their Regional Bureau for East Africa. From Bangladesh, we have Marwa Tasnim, who is an analyst at Start Fund Bangladesh. And then last but not least, we have Mariam Parakashvili, Project Associate at the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security, which is UNUEHS. So we'll start using the abbreviations, I'm sure, later in the discussion. Now, what I'm going to do is invite and remind you all to use the chat function. I think some of you are already starting to do that, to make remarks, share any interesting details of your work during the webinar so that others on the platform are able to see that, and then we can share that later. But before we get to our context setting presentations, we're going to have a quick participant poll. And in a second, you're going to see these questions, which are on the screen before you. And Anais is going to launch a little quiz via in fact, there it is. It's already there. So the first question is there a risk of gender-based violence, GBV, in CDRFI, so climate and disaster risk finance and insurance value chains? So choose the answer yes or no. Second question is, does the insurance provider have a responsibility to address gender-based violent risks in CDRFI? Again, choose your answer, yes or no. And then finally, where do you think there is the greatest gender-based violence risks in CDRFI? Now here you've got a number of options. You can say in the access to payouts, in the usage of payouts, in the control of payouts, or you can state something else. And if you have another answer, please just state that in the chat box. So we'll just give you a moment to do your poll. So answer the questions before you, so you can tick the boxes. Okay. And in a second, Anais will let us know when we're ready to see the results.
Yes, I can wait a few more seconds. I see still people are answering, but
fantastic.
Okay. Let's stop it now.
Thank you very much.
Are you able to see the results?
Yes, we are. So in terms of the first result, overwhelmingly, 95% of you think that, yes, there is a risk of gender-based violence in CDRFI value chains. And 100% of you think that the insurance provider has a responsibility to address these risks in CDRFI. If we then look at the third question, which is where the greatest risks are, what you can see here is access to payouts seems to be the highest scoring choice. So 32% of you said access to payouts. Slightly smaller number said, at 26% said usage of payouts, and equal numbers said control and other. So buying the policy, for instance, was one of the examples that we can see in the chat box as well. So actually that interaction, how you then, when you go and buy that insurance policy or access that program. So thank you very much for sharing those results. What we're going to do now, before we get into the participant discussion, I think it's really useful for us to sort of set a little bit of context to why we're talking about this topic of gender-based violence and the context of it in the framework of looking at climate change and disasters. So we're really delighted to be joined by Johanna Simau, who is a senior gender specialist at IFAD, who is going to run through a little bit about the business case of why we should be looking at this. So over to you, Johanna. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and good morning or afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak about this very critical topic today. And next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, perfect. And just before starting to present, I'd like to inform you that this session will discuss themes that may bring some discomfort and difficult emotions. So please take care of yourself. And also another disclaimer is that while the PARM and IFAD that I'm happily working with are very much committed to promoting gender equality and fighting GBV, gender-based violence, this presentation will introduce the topic of gender, climate change, and disaster, and not IFAD's work nor any specific organization's work. And this presentation will give a brief overview of the complex interlinkages between GBV, climate change, and disasters. And there would be much more to say, but I will share resources in the chat and of course, happy to discuss further after this session. So next slide, please. Perfect. So just to briefly introduce the topic, climate change and climate-related disasters such as drought and flooding, as you know, are not gender neutral. And they actually exacerbate rooted gender norms, inequalities, and discrimination, including GBV. And so first, disaster-related resource scarcity represents a violence. The current environmental degradation and the growing natural resource scarcity due to climate change result in increasing and exacerbating climate-related disasters. And in contexts where gender inequalities are deeply rooted and women have a more limited access to resources, including natural resources, disaster-related resource scarcity worsens this difficult access women have and expose them to a higher risk of GBV. Why? Due to climate change and even more in the aftermath of a disaster, women spend more time and travel longer distances to collect water, food, fuels, and other resources needed for their household. And just to give you an idea, collectively in the world, women and girls spend more than 200 hours fighting and collecting water every day. 200 hours that they cannot dedicate for themselves, for their education, for income-generating activities and self-care. 200 hours that expose them to a much higher risk of gender-based violence while traveling those long and dangerous roads. And this is only for water. So I'll let you imagine the amount, the extent of the burden. And this growing burden of unpaid care work to provide the household with resources also becomes the burden of GBV risk due to climate change and resulting disasters. For instance, just to name a few figures amongst many, unfortunately, a recent study reports that 85% of women in Borno State in Nigeria express fear of rape, murder, and abduction while collecting firewood. And in this process of collection, 8 out of every 10 girls are actually either kidnapped or sexually assaulted. Next slide, please. And the growing scarcity of natural resources and land causes extreme tension and competition between and within communities and households. As you know, women have more restricted land tenure rights, and this restriction is even worsened by climate disasters. Gender inequalities are actually amplified and lead to a rise in various forms of GBV that are used as a means of control over resources, as well as over women's bodies and existing power imbalances. And sexual extortion has been reported in several countries as an extremely violent way to access and control scarce natural resources and land. Just some examples of these forms of violence. Within the household, there's a rise in intimate partner violence rates, since men use violence in many forms as a means to exert control over scarce resources. Women can be forced to sexual extortion to access some land rights, and in case they have any land right or title, they can face many types of abuse in forced land grabbing. On other types of resources, there is, for example, one phenomenon that is increasing and being more documented in mostly Eastern and Southern Africa, that is sex for fish. For instance, in Malawi, mothers have been forced to trade their daughters' fish. A bit further south in Zambia, some fishermen may demand sex from women traders to sell fish to them, abusing them their position of power. And sometimes transactional sex is the only way to get access to sea resources and also other resources in other contexts. And so in case of a climate-related disaster, as we know, the rule of law is weakened, and all means are engaged to access resources to survive, which does not justify them. And this contributes to the exploitation, including sexual exploitation of women, men, girls, and boys who can be forced to engage in criminal activities and forced labor, such as illegal logging and mining, that are known to highly expose to several forms of GBV. And in the aftermath of a disaster, due to the limited, even restricted and forbidden access to resources, women see their livelihoods completely wiped out by extreme weather events and disaster. And with few or no resources, they have a much harder time recovering and may find themselves in a position of financial dependence, and therefore are even more exposed to several types of GBV. It can be economic violence within the household from the partner maintaining the control over finances and maintaining women in financial dependency. And also in some families, it's been reported that in response to resource scarcity, child marriage has been used as a coping strategy to reduce the costs of the child-centered marriage without her consent, of course. Next slide, please. And another pillar that I'd like us to have a look at is the situation of women environmental defenders who also become GBV survivors because they defend the environment. And so we have more and more women environmental defenders because we're in a context in which climate-related disasters are growing and being exacerbated. And while all environmental defenders can be exposed to violence regardless of their gender, women do face specific forms of violence based on their gender. And this violence is even reinforced when it intersects with race and ethnicity. This is why women from indigenous communities are particularly exposed, since they're often on the front lines of defending their land. And also another aspect of that is that in communities, societies, countries where women's leadership and decision-making are not common or even prevented, taking the lead to defend nature, climate, and the environment can expose women to GBV. GBV is then used as a means to maintain power structures out there as they are unbalanced, and to discourage women to promote their own rights and the rights of the environment, because it would mean more rights and resources for women, and it would jeopardize structures and businesses that benefit from damaging the environment. And just two quick figures on that to illustrate this idea. In 2022 in Colombia, 60% of women environmental defenders experienced GBV, including sexual assault. And in Mexico and Central America, more than 600 cases of GBV have been recorded over a year of time against women environmental defenders. Next slide. Yes, next slide, please. And so a third and last aspect of today's topic is the specific situation of women and girls on the move in the context of migration due to climate change and disasters. So this context of climate-related disasters is also a driver of migration and displacement for women. And being on the move highly exposes them to GBV, including human trafficking. For example, temporary housing and emergency shelters are particularly dangerous for women and girls who can suffer from various forms of GBV. And being on the move for women and girls they bring with them the burden of unpaid care work that includes collecting water, fuel, and firewood for the household. And this puts an additional pressure on both resources and on women. On resources first, because in fragile contexts, host communities and refugees have no other choice but to collect resources to survive, which overexploits them. And second, more pressure on women, for whom it becomes much harder and more dangerous to collect these scarce resources and meet their family needs. Next slide, please. So here are some resources. If you'd like to learn more about the linkages between GBV, climate change, and disaster, I'll share them in the chat as well. Very happy to discuss. And very final slide. Please, next slide. And just thank you for your attention, and feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna. That's incredible. It really highlights the severity of this challenge. And we don't have such data, and I think we'll come to that later in some of our discussions about the prevalence, but we do know that it's very prevalent, and also there's different forms of gender-based violence. So we'll explore that, I think, in our panel discussion in a moment. Just to provide some further context for our discussion, I'm going to just give you a very quick and high-level sort of ideas on the gender dimensions of CDRFI from this gender-based violence perspective. So what we know is that there are gender impacts of all CDRFI instruments, so climate and disaster risk financing and insurance instruments. Next slide, please. And the deployment of these different instruments has the opportunity to acknowledge these gender differential vulnerabilities to climate change and the disasters that we've heard. So this difference between men and women and the intersectional dimensions of that as well. Now, these impacts, as we've just heard, can include gender-based violence impacts. So the results of these hazards. And so these instruments can also hold potential to influence the dynamics of these different behaviours, norms and relationships between people based on gender, and related very specifically also to norms around gender-based violence, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And the specific risks for each instrument will vary, and that will based on the type of funding, the type of instrument that we're looking at. And so will the type of risk, where that risk is. And it partly will be because of the way that maybe money is transferred and to whom, and also the gender context that we're operating in. We know that gender contexts vary from place to place significantly, and also within countries as well. Next slide, please. Now, we know that there are different models of climate and disaster risk financing and insurance at a micro and meso level, which are quite similar to each other. Generally, it may be the private sector or kind of a donor-supported program that is offering this type of insurance. And these risks that emerge related to gender-based violence will be dependent on the actual business model itself. And so that's something to bear in mind. And there are going to be opportunities to address these at the product design level, maybe through ways a product is marketed and its sales and distribution approach, and also in how clients are serviced as well. So an opportunity related to this is to conduct a gender-based risk violence assessment on the customer journey for beneficiaries to help identify what these potential risks are. For instance, we've already heard in the starting poll, the interaction with the customer and the provider or the intermediary during premium payment, while accessing payments, or the tension that arises when that payment has been made, or in non-payout situations as well. It could also be that as staff travel to support payouts or service clients, they themselves may face risks, but they may also pose risks to those who are purchasing the insurance or being serviced. So in addition to the risk assessment, there are ways that, that assessment itself could potentially identify approaches to addressing the risks. And one way may be to integrate some of these topics into messaging within insurance and financial literacy training materials and workshops, for instance. Another may be that the insurance provider itself could be setting up a complaints mechanism that allows people to be able to highlight some of these issues that might arise in interaction with staff or in payout situations. Next slide, please. And we know that there's also macro models of different forms of CDRFI, and some of which are regional, some are at country level. And that's where the government, or it could be at a city level as well, are the policy holders. And some of these kind of risks that we might think about related to this on gender-based violence is around ensuring that budget is allocated in the government policy is for these insurance products, sovereign insurance products, to allocate funding to gender-based violence after a disaster, for instance, like to address and mitigate any violence, and also provide shelters, for instance. There are still the similar kinds of risks as within micro models as well. So risks might also be as a result of payment of cash transfers, how beneficiaries access these payments. If they're having to travel, as we've heard from Johanna about, sort of as women are traveling particularly, they face risks, gender-based violence risks. And so if they're having to travel to get a payment as well, that might be an issue that they face. And also if they're sharing personal details, mobile phone numbers, for instance, for digital payments of cash transfers. So there can be opportunities to address these risks at a macro level through capacity building of the target beneficiaries, again, in the same way as they might be receiving financial literacy training, they may be receiving some kind of training around social protection payments at a time of emergency. And so there's an opportunity to include messaging potentially there as well. So these are different ways that we can think about gender-based violence in different models. We're going to explore this a little bit more in a second. So we're going to move on to our panel discussion now and hearing actual examples from those of you who are implementing programs related to CDRFI. So without further ado, we're going to focus on the risks and good practices in CDRFI from gender-based violence and how these are being addressed in existing CDRFI programming, So I think we'll start with Faith. Faith, you're with the Wealth Fee Programme. With your work, let's just start first of all about definitions and thinking about that. We've heard a bit about definitions already from Johanna. So sort of building on that, what do we actually mean by gender-based violence, and what forms of gender-based violence do we need to consider in climate and disaster risk financing and insurance? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And I'm just going to build on what Johanna presented earlier around, what do we even mean, the basics, what do we mean by gender-based violence, and our understanding, and I know I'm speaking to the converted, gender-based violence is any act of abuse or violence that results to physical or sexual or mental or all of them suffering, particularly to someone because of their gender norms and the society in which they live in. And we all know gender-based violence often affects particular groups of people in disproportionate ways. And Johanna again has touched on the different forms of gender-based violence that we see as practitioners in the field. And we know the physical violence and sexual violence. There's also emotional violence, economic forms of violence, psychological violence, and over time we're beginning to see examples and reports around online violence as well, or what they're calling ICT facilitated violence. And obviously globally there's a lot more awareness, and not to say that there's more reporting, but there's more awareness of physical violence and sexual violence, though it's thoroughly still underreported. But other forms of violence, like economic violence, often end up being under-recognized, underreported, and therefore under-addressed. And so, for example, we see with CDRFI programs and policies like we see in the field, they end up triggering certain intra-household dynamics that we may not have invested enough resources and intention into understanding, and therefore it is important that we do that so that we don't exacerbate already existing forms like this. We know that through cash-based transfers, for example, and different financial inclusion processes, they often increase women's access to financial resources, which obviously promotes more agency and helps contribute to decision making. And in some of our programs, we've seen that having a direct contribution to reduction in gender-based violence, because there's more dialogue in a household between spouses. I hope that's sufficient.
Yeah, no, that's really, really helpful. And just sort of that intersection with agency, and that actually having extra financial resources might actually drive agency, which is a key part of like the sort of that control of decision making, which actually can reduce gender-based violence as opposed to necessarily increase it. And also this intra-household dynamics. And it was interesting you put that theme about investing in looking at that, given that investing in prevention is what the theme is of Unite this year. So now it's really helpful to set the scene, Faith, and give us some of the examples that you've shared. Let's turn then to Mariam now. And together, the UNU EHS with UNCDF has been implementing the Pacific Insurance Climate Adaptation Programme, PCAP. So maybe with the work that you've been doing in the Pacific region, can you please maybe just introduce a few of the risks that you've been identifying and how in the context of your climate risk insurance work at the sort of micro-meso level? Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you to all the other panelists and also the great presentations, because I was listening to it and really could relate to many of the points made, because this is actually what we are seeing in the implementation of our program in South Pacific Small Island Development States. So as you mentioned, we are developing micro level climate risk insurance products. And we aim to have 50% of women. But to give a bit of background, Fiji is one of the countries in the world with the highest level of gender-based violence. So according to the Fiji Women Crisis Center, 70% of women have reported gender-based violence when it comes to intimate relationship with their partners. So this was definitely a crucial aspect for us to take into consideration in our research and implementation activities of PCAP. And as you can imagine, we did the desk research and consultations with the different stakeholders locally and also internationally to find out what the risk could be. With our work, what could be the activities we could maybe unintentionally perpetuate gender-based violence further, right? Because as we are working on developing climate risk insurance, of course, we hope to have the payout to help the communities to increase their resilience against climate risks. But also, we realize with this desk research and consultations that actually payouts can also lead to gender-based violence in the dynamics, intra-household dynamics can really change. So that was definitely one of the findings. And I would really want to emphasize today also the payout and non-payout situations, because earlier this year, there was the cyclone in Fiji, Tonga, and Vanuatu, which are our countries, the target countries. And our team in Fiji received many calls of frustrated women who were really frustrated because of the fact that they didn't receive the payout. And now we have to also consider the culture and social norms in Fiji are that women are not really outspoken about the house internal matters. So yeah, yes, definitely. That was kind of the evidence for us that it has really paid to work on it, actually, to work on the devising the plan, how to tackle these issues. And I hope to have more time later to give the exact examples, what we also, how we do it and how we are going forward as we are expanding to new regions and countries.
That's great. That's really great. I mean, understanding actually this importance of the cultural context, and that's about investing, as we heard from Faith, investing in understanding what the intra-household dynamics are, or the country context, and identifying that. And you've named a few different ways in which you've done that through the stakeholder consultation, the desk research. So that was part of your investment process and understanding. So I guess it's just as much about the process as actually identifying what the actual impacts are, or potential or unintended impacts. I think let's move on to Anina now. Now, we've heard about research and the contribution that research plays to this process, and asking the right questions to understand the prevalence of GBV risks from CDRFI perspective. Now, you're working on a project related to the urban infrastructure insurance facility for ICLEI, for I think cities in Latin America and Caribbean. So maybe could you provide us a bit of background and about the GBV risks you've been identifying from this urban infrastructure climate risk insurance perspective? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely, Catherine. And hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. I wanted to first extend a huge thank you to our hosts for the invitation to speak on today's panel and this very crucial topic. I'm very thrilled to expand upon the work that we're doing with the Urban Infrastructure Insurance Facility Project, or just UIIF for short. But in a nutshell, it's a project that's based in Latin America and the Caribbean, with the ICLEI World Secretariat facilitating it, and our regional offices in Brazil and Mexico implementing it with funding from KfW through BMZ. And to provide a bit of a context here about the Latin America and Caribbean region, it is often considered the world's most urbanized and socially unequal region, and many cities are on the forefront in response to those climate-related hazards. In line with that, it is all too often that it means that the people that are the most vulnerable to the impact of natural disasters are at the intersection of poverty, disabilities, ethnicity, and of course, gender. So with the UIF project, it aims to better protect critical infrastructure that will cover 7.5 million vulnerable population segments from the impacts of natural hazards in a risk pool made up of 10 Latin America and Caribbean cities. And this will be implemented by developing tailor-made insurance products hand in hand with government officials, linking partnerships with the insurance industry, and bridging very much this information and data gap regarding hazards and vulnerability. So in line with this, kindly with the support of the technical advisory facility from the Centre of Excellence for Gender Smart Solutions, we've gained valuable insight on how we can better encourage
gender responsiveness when the cities ultimately receive their urban risk assessments, and with that information inform the development of these tailor-made insurance products, with ideally implementing gender-based violence considerations in that. So we're still at the beginning stages of our project, but we have been we're still identifying what kinds of possible gaps and challenges might occur. And a couple of these fall into two categories. The first is that we anticipate there being a technical gap. So as we know, challenges arise from a lack of capacity to sometimes comprehend socioeconomic vulnerability, and gender disaggregated data is crucial for understanding the specific needs and vulnerabilities of different groups. So with this, even if there is data availability, which in our experience so far has been quite lacking, there is the real possibility that there might be a lack of capacity or expertise to effectively utilize it for insurance product design and payout priorities, like, for example, urban transportation, which is critical infrastructure that so many women depend upon. And the second risk that we are taking into consideration is financial. It's a reality of many local governments around the world, but especially in the region that UIIF is based. And unfortunately, they do tend to lack adequate budgets for supporting data acquisition, capacity building, or even policy development. And they don't always have the financial freedom and time to allocate on this crucial topic like women's safety, or ensuring that women have access to resources in the aftermath of a disaster. And it's not that this is something that they don't care about, but it just might not be as high of a prioritization for that administration. And this is something that we would like to address with the UIIF project.
Thank you. I think what you've raised, which is I think so important, is around the technical expertise in gender-based violence. And I'm sure many of the people who are here on the call today have some expertise on that and interest, because that's why they're here. But then there's also the capacity building side, which is, for those that don't know about it, learning about it. And then there's some cross-cutting issues you've raised as well around this need to be able to gather and use sex disaggregated data around vulnerability. And when we're looking at insurance, we're looking at about risk in terms of hazard, vulnerability and exposure. And it's on that vulnerability side, which actually the IPCC has said specifically we need to be gathering more sex disaggregated data, and GBV data is a useful kind of contributor to that. So, you know, fascinating work that you're doing, and we look forward to hearing more about that. Let's turn to Marwa now. Marwa, you are at the implementation stage, so you're a slightly different stage, aren't you, from Anina? And so how have you been, or how do you think about gender-based violence risks in your work at the START network? And what are the risks that you've been identifying in looking at rapid response and disaster risk financing in Bangladesh, please? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So thank for giving me the opportunity to speak today. So I'm representing START Network, and I'm based in Bangladesh. So most of my experience today shared will be from Bangladesh specifically, but some experience we are facing in developing different program and financing stream in globally as well. So the risk of gender-based violence is not often prioritized enough as we would like to, especially in humanitarian responses and operational spaces in our country. And what we see is that women, adolescent girls who are already impacted by a crisis or a disaster, who are already in a vulnerable state, are in result exposed to additional risk of gender-based violence. And some of the examples we have identified, the risks they face are that the risk of their data, their information being shared or mismanaged or leaked, which is a very, like, as humanitarians, we would not want to happen. We often think that GBV is that only bad people in community are exposing the women or girls to a gender-based violence, which is not often the case. We as humanitarians, when we are implementing a project, we collect different kind of data from the community, such as name, their addresses, their contact numbers. And when those informations are not managed in a responsible way, these can expose the community, especially the women, to a risk of being harassed, being abused, or being taken advantage of, which even though as humanitarians we are going to a community with goodwill, good intentions, can expose them to the risk of gender-based violence. And to mitigate that, we have to come up with a protocol that we, not just as organizations, as staffs, we introduce these protocols to our volunteers, our community-based organizations, the local organization, the local communities, those grassroots communities, and which is really required. And one of the things we identified, which was very recently experienced, is that in Bangladesh, many of the female NGO staffs do not want to be included in the humanitarian response operations. We have a staff ratio of 20% to 80% female to male, which is very less female coming to this spectrum, because they often do not feel safe enough to go to the remote locations being affected by crises. And which is why in a recent humanitarian response to Cyclone Mocha, where we saw that and local NGO was responding, and their female staff and volunteers were not feeling safe enough to go to a remote island to respond to the humanitarian project. They approached us and wanted to mitigate this risk. Like, how can we do this? Like, we're a local grassroots NGO, and we don't have the capacity to enable our female staff to go to a remote island without any safety precautions. So what we did as Start Fund is that we allocated a percentage of our fund to ensure that those female staff and volunteers have their proper accommodation and safety measures in that remote island throughout the project period from our funding mechanism, so that we can ensure that those staff and volunteers are feeling safe enough to respond to the humanitarian crises.
That's really useful. It's really useful to hear that you know, how actually the finance itself is being used for resource allocation to support your staff as well. And then also this issue around gender-based violence as a root cause of participation, you know, the low levels of women's participation in the humanitarian operations. I think we'll come back to some of these in a moment, some of these themes. I'd like to pick up on this theme of practical action now and move to faith again, and just understand a little bit more about the work that you're doing at WFP in your region, and how you're addressing these gender-based risks, gender-based violence risks that you've been talking about, and what both WFP, but also we've heard just now about partners as well. What are you doing with your humanitarian partners going forward to address this? Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I really first resonate with what Marwa has said. We see it a lot, particularly in this region, where most of the countries that we work in are affected by long years of droughts. And if it's not droughts, then it's the floods. And in those very deep field locations, the gender parity is really, the numbers are really concerning. And it's because of issues like your personal safety and security to work in some of these areas. But just to go back to your question around what are some of the things WFP is doing together with our other humanitarian partners, I think over time we've been more intentional in even resourcing, and sometimes it also starts with just the human resource, having actual gender-based violence specialists within the organization and other protection experts in different parts of the organization, including deep in the field. We've also benefited from the InsuResilience Centre of Excellence in assessing some of our insurance programs in Ethiopia, for example, where we do micro insurance. An interesting one has been the expansion of like our evidence base to inform our insurance programs. For example, in Ethiopia, for the macro insurance program, we're investing in a gender analysis that will inform the designing and the targeting for this work. And it's interesting because we recently did a user journey analysis on mobile money within the same context a few years ago, and just seeing how some of the outcomes around control of the payouts especially for social protection programs, control of the payouts that come in, of the cash transfers, and how those affect even women as individuals, but as members of a household and their dynamics with their partners. It's been interesting, and we are doing a lot more on that, where we have our insurance and climate and disaster risk programs. We also have a new gender policy that really is getting towards what the rest of gender expertise and experts across the world are doing with gender transformative programming, where, recognizing what the root causes of gender based violence are, how these speak to issues around food security, and investing in these approaches that really try to address those root causes. And we have a good example in Kenya with our microinsurance program, where we have women's groups in the village savings loans associations, and now working with their couples and doing this household family transformation model. And one of the key outcomes has been the reduction of gender-based violence in their houses, and of course awareness raising. There's a lot of work happening in the communities that we work with, through our partners, through our local partners, in raising awareness around gender-based violence, using our complaints and feedback mechanisms to transfer and to refer some of the cases that are reported to us, as well as even within our staffs, just making sure we are, for example, like with the Unite campaign for the 16 days, raising the awareness around masculine norms and online forms of violence, because we believe that, it starts with our own attitudes and perceptions, and understanding what our individual roles are in mitigating gender-based violence, and also transferring that and using that behavior change when we have to make decisions around programs. In terms of what we can do better and do more as humanitarian actors, and as organizations like WFP, I think there's a huge need for investing in working with local partners and grassroots organizations, intentionally financing them. They understand the context better, they know these social norms better, but we know oftentimes one of the biggest barriers is not having the financing and not having the institutional muscle to be in platforms where decisions around policies are influenced and made. So I think there's a critical role for humanitarian actors at different levels to really support grassroots organizations. And of course, where you have, for example, WFP that has government as one of our key partners, like in Somalia. So really also building the capacity of governments to understand and recognize and prioritize gender-based violence, and to use the information that we have around GBV in when they're developing policies. And I think the robust evidence generation, I think the work around gender-based violence continues to suffer data. We have a huge dearth of evidence and data around GBV. It's different linkages with different sectors. And so there's a huge role and gap in how we systemize the way we collect this data and the way we use this data to influence our climate disaster risk finances, policies and programs.
Thank you. No, you've picked up so many varied but important themes, one of which, of course, is resource allocation, again, in this theme of investment. But what I think also partnerships as a theme, and it's partnerships both with women's organisations to understand that context, but partnerships also with them and governments to address the challenge as well. So it's both in the understanding and the definition, but also the response. So fascinating, great examples of practical things that you've done as well, or intending to do. Anina, let's move back to you now. I mean, you're still at this early stages with the UIF, but how are you intending to be addressing these GBV risks going forward through the UIF?
Well, yes, indeed. We are still at the beginning of the project stages, but there are a few considerations in how we intend to address gender-based violence in UIF. So firstly, the UIF project was not explicitly designed with gender considerations in mind. This was something that we actively implemented in our project operations manual while providing capacity building to the selected cities to empower them in taking steps to tailoring their insurance products with gender considerations. So, for example, very recently in October, we had our very first workshop and virtual gathering with the selected cities, which was exciting. And as a follow-up in this workshop, we provided them with a homework assignment on questions relating to hazards, infrastructure, and vulnerable population segments within their city, in particular, an emphasis on gender demographics, if the data exists. But the intention with this is for them to present this homework in person next week, actually, in Costa Rica, where we will be having our in-person UIIF pre-urban risk assessment workshop. And by then, the cities will have pre-informed idea of what kind of infrastructure that they would like to ensure and the vulnerable populations that will be covered. So in line with this, during that event itself, we will have a gender session dedicated to highlighting gender-based violence risks related to urban infrastructure. And this will further inform decision-making and hopefully inspire them to consider gender-based violence when ensuring critical infrastructure. But it also should be noted that a baseline design is still needed to tailor the support that cities need in this regard. Another important consideration with gender-based violence and our UIIF work is that countries and cities have different capacities, as mentioned earlier by you, Catherine, and different contexts as a result of their decentralization framework and how mature their policies are. So while we can inform our cities and develop urban risk assessments that highlight their vulnerabilities and provide these capacity building opportunities, a case-by-case approach will be needed to be kept in mind. So looking to the future, we're very much looking forward to continuing this momentum of addressing gender-based violence risks within UIIF as it develops.
Yeah, fascinating. We'll be watching that space, and it's going to be really fascinating to see how the different countries identify slightly different risks and move forward with their, well, I say different countries because it's cities actually at the city level, but how they're going to be addressing that and the results of those risk assessments. So yeah, we'll all be watching that space, certainly. Mariam, let's go back to you now, and you're slightly further on stage with your work, and it is a discrete program, whereas WFP we've hearing about before is lots of different programs, sort of, whereas this is a discrete program. But you're at the expansion phase of PCAP as well, beyond Fiji into the wider Pacific. So what are the current approaches and gaps and lessons learned you've been taking through PCAP to address these GBV risks associated with your climate risk insurance work?
Thank you. I mean, I can resonate on so many points that were mentioned previously by colleagues, because I have to also thank you as the part of the partnership we had within the framework of InsuResilience technical advisor facility, because that was really eye-opening and really giving us so many opportunities, the opinions, how we could really integrate and tackle those issues. So thank you very much for that. And now to give you kind of the structured, I think we are aiming and implementing these lessons learned from the first 2 years of implementation on the new countries we are expanding to, based on partnerships and how we are currently approaching in terms of finding new partners in local cooperative organizations, for example, or the insurance partners, how we are trying to develop with them and with regulators the complaints mechanism, and we are working on it currently. And at the really highlight for our work and kind of shaped up the lessons learned for us was the collaboration with the UN Women Fiji office, where we jointly organized the gender-based violence workshop in Fiji and invited different stakeholders from locally, but also internationally, to tackle some of the issues. It was not specifically about the payout and non-payout situations, but like really as simple as inviting women to, trainings or the awareness raising events that could also lead to gender-based violence. So this is the examples how we then devise the plan, how we are approaching now the new countries. I mean, of course, the experience of Fiji is the different context, and you can really generalize on others, but some of the examples and some of the ways you can definitely translate and apply it to. As I mentioned, the complaints mechanism with the insurance sector. Also, one way we are trying to tackle this is finding the local champions who could be then players within their communities, raising awareness of the importance of gender-based violence and generally what it can be and how many different forms it has. Another very important process we are doing now, and it's also kind of the reflection on the work with the IGP we had, because earlier this year there were 1,000 payouts, around 1,000 payouts, insurance payouts in Fiji, Tonga and Vanuatu, and 50% almost women received the payout. But there are also examples where there was no payout, and as I mentioned, that caused frustration within the by the beneficiaries. So currently we are analyzing the data we collected post payout survey we did last month, 2 months ago, in Fiji, in the three countries, and currently we are analyzing, because we included the questions regarding the control of the payout, if they received the payout, how this kind of influenced the dynamics within the households, or if they did not receive the payout. So all those different and very interesting and critical questions we asked, and we hope to have the results early next year, and I'm happy to share with the audience.
Yeah, we look forward.
There.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, this is fascinating. So you've also mentioned some different stakeholders that we need to think about. So the regulator, for instance, and that relates to consumer protection and market conduct and complaints mechanisms. So that's something we haven't all unpacked, but for another time. The other thing is around technical stakeholders who have gender expertise, such as UN agencies, UN Women. And evaluation indicators to track, and it might not be GBV that you're tracking, but actually you can get insights around GBV through other indicators around access and control, and usage. So that's fascinating. We're going to turn back to Marwa for a second time and just hear a little bit more about the practical steps that you've been taking in the Bangladesh context through your operations. So can you elaborate a little bit more about the current approaches that you've taken and how you're looking to replicate and build on this through your institutional approaches at START? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So yes, we have been working with the InsuResilience team. So thank you so much for Catherine for giving us kind of short-term and long-term recommendations, how we can integrate the gender lens and come up with gender smart solutions for our interventions and our programs. Where START Network, we offer different financing mechanisms for our membership, and it's difficult how we can integrate the gender lens in these terms. So when we are implementing the different projects under these financing streams, what we have come up with an idea that we report back to community, like for generating gender smart solutions, we have to go back to the community, discuss with them, ask them what are their challenges, what are the issues they're facing, how they would like these issues to be addressed, come up with some ideas. What we do in our network is that we get those ideas from the community, go back to our membership. We have a diverse membership of 45 NGOs in Bangladesh alone, where there is local NGO, national NGO, and international NGO. So we come up together, discuss, and take out some interventions that, yes, this is how we can address gender-based violence. We can address gender lenses into our programs. And what we do is that we take those interventions to the wider stakeholders. We take it to the gender experts. We take it to the local government. We take it to the national government so that we can curate and validate those interventions to be more smart, more community-based, more locally led. And then what we do is that we go back again to the drawing board, to the community, so that, yes, I took those challenges from you. Now I'm reporting back to you that, yes, we took these challenges, and now we have come up with these actions to address your challenges. do you feel like that these actions address what your challenges, your risks, and what you're needing? Does this clarify, is this the solutions to your problems? So, and if it's not, how can we address this? And that is the way of working that we have come up in our programs in START Network to address our gender-based violence, not just gender-based violence, all the risks, how we program it and how we implement it. So thank you.
Thank you, Mara. That's fantastic. And it's really about hearing about institutional approaches which relate just not to yourselves, but also your partners in country. At this point, we're going to start wrapping up everything. I want to put Johanna a little bit on the spot and say, is there one sentence of a kind of a key takeaway from you, from the panel, that you'd like to just share with everyone as we close?
I think that one of the highlights that comes out of this very rich discussion is working closely with the communities and building this trust between us and communities, because they're knowledgeable and they're powerful.
That's fantastic. Thank you. So, yeah, I mean, just to, I guess, summarize, and I'd love to go round and spend another hour talking to all of you and continue this discussion. We'll have to create another time for it. But I think building also on what we've heard from Johanna as well, and all of your fantastic insights, is this this role of partnerships and to identify, but also to address the GBV challenges in CDRFI, and that they're different stakeholders, from governments to regulators to women's groups, as well as the CDRFI providers who you're working with. There's also this issue of investment in not only engaging with them, but also data collection and understanding the context and being intentional in that. And creating, therefore, through this investment, these institutional tools and complaint mechanisms. And I think on this data perspective, it's about understanding vulnerability. CDRFI is about vulnerability to certain hazards and exposure to that. We're trying to understand the vulnerability to GBV in the value chains and the exposure to that, which will vary by context and instrument. But finally, when we're thinking about these risks to these different forms of GBV that we've been highlighting, what we mustn't forget, it's not just a risk, but addressing it through CDRFI is an opportunity, because it allows us to potentially change the control that women have financially, and that can be a positive impact, which can potentially reduce GBV, which evidence has shown in some of the work that has already been done with some of these instruments. So look, from my side, thank you very much. I'd love to just say a big thank you to the speakers and panelists today for these rich discussions and insights. I think now we're just going to hand over to Ines to say a few closing words and go back to the screen. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Catherine. Yes, I'm unmuted. Thank you, Catherine. And a warm thanks to all the speakers and the panelists for the rich discussion and the insights shared today. I think gender-based violence is an important and complex layer to be considered in the context of our work. So we need to continue to have these conversations and continue to push for the integration of gender-based violence considerations in the design of CDRFI solutions. Now, as we close this session, I would like to invite you to visit the COE website for more information and access to more research and guidance notes on on gender and CDRFI nexus. And of course, to invite you to please share the resources on gender and CDRFI with us to distribute on our platform. Lastly, I would like to ask participants to keep in touch with both the InsuResilience and PharmD teams. And before you disappear today, please provide us with a feedback on the webinar via the evaluation. Thanks again, and a lovely afternoon, day, and night to all of you.